Hello. In this video, I will be walking you through all the steps that you need in order to deploy your application automatically in the MIE container creation script. This video will be broken down into two parts. In the first part, I'll walk you through the steps of deploying an application that consists of a single component, and then in the second part, I'll walk you through the process of deploying an application with multiple components. And I'll talk about this more later, but what I mean by a component is a independent service or independent process that requires its own package list, its own installation commands, and its own start commands in order to run. And with multiple components, you might have multiple of these independent sort of services that run collectively to power your applications. So before you get started, you need to make sure that you have a Proxmox account, a valid one on the MIE cluster. If you do not already, please feel free to reach out to me or Carter Myers, and we'll set one up for you. Once you have a valid Proxmox account, you're going to open up a terminal on your machine and enter this SSH command to SSH to a container which contains a script to create our container. So I'm just going to type in SSH create container at open source mieweb.mieweb.org. Now this is going to jump through different containers and run a force command as sudo to run the container creation script. So it's going to take a few seconds to load. If it asks for a password, just type in MIE all lowercase 123 exclamation mark. That's MIE 123 exclamation mark, and you should be granted access. Once we're in, the first thing we're going to do is enter our Proxmox username. So I'm going to enter mine as demo user because I'm using a test account. And my password's going to be whatever the password to your account is. The next step is going to ask for our application name. Be mindful when you're choosing your application name because this will be represented in your domain name. For example, if my application name is Max, then the domain to my container will be max.opensource.mieweb.org. So try to choose a name that represents your container in its functionality. Because this is a demo, I'm just going to write test demo 1. If our hostname is valid and available in our cluster, you will be notified and you can move on to the next step. If not, you're just going to simply enter a new container name. The next step requires us to enter a password for our container. Again, this password is going to be different from your Proxmox account password. It can be the same, but it is good practice to keep the passwords separate. In the future, we will be migrating to an LDAP server, so you won't even need to do this step. Enter a password that's at least 8 characters, and make sure to include some special characters too, just to make it more secure. Next, we're going to choose the Linux distribution we want for our container. Right now, you can choose between Debian 12 or Bookworm, or Rocky 9. I always like to stick with Debian, so I'm just going to type in Debian. However, Rocky works too. The next step is going to ask you for a public key to append to your authorized key files in your container. Since I already ran this script before, it already detected my public key and it's going to automatically add that key to my container. This way, when I try to enter or SSH to my container, I won't have to enter the password, which makes it more secure and more efficient to log in. You can skip this step, but I do recommend that you put your public key in. To access your public key, it's usually located in your .ssh directory in your home folder. However, if you do not have any public or private key pairs generated, you can use the ssh-keygen command to generate a new set of RSA or 825519 keys. The next step is going to ask us for an HTTP port that we want our container to listen on. Because my application uses port 32,000, I'm going to enter that here. Make sure your port is in the range of 80 to 60,000. The next step is going to ask if your container requires any special protocols. 99% of the time, SSH and HTTP will be sufficient, but if your application requires a special protocol that you need access to, then you can enter it here. But since I don't need any, I'm just going to hit enter to skip. The next step is very important and highlights the whole idea of this video. If we have an application such that is housed in a GitHub repository that we want to deploy automatically, or in other words, as soon as the container is created, you just navigate to a link and your application's already deployed, we want to go through with these next steps. So to do that, you're just going to hit Y and continue. However, if you just want a basic container without all of those steps and configure it yourself, you can skip this step and your container will automatically begin cloning from a template. Since I want to deploy mine, again, I'm just going to hit Y and continue. The first step it's going to ask is the link to our public GitHub repository. To get this, I'm just going to navigate to my web browser here. I have the repository that I want to deploy from, so I'm just going to copy this link. I'm going to go back to my script, and I'm going to paste this link in. For these first few steps, if you enter any information about your repository that's actually invalid, for example, if I give an invalid repository link or a branch name that doesn't exist, the script will actually detect that and will notify you and have you try again until you enter a valid credential. So next, I'm going to enter the branch that I want to deploy from. I'm just going to deploy from my main branch. However, if you have a specific branch that you want to deploy from too, you would just enter that here. But for main, I'm just going to hit skip. However, if your main branch is called master, make sure to type in master here. The next step is entering the root directory that I want to deploy from. Again, 99% of the time, it's just going to be from your root directory in your GitHub repository. However, if there's a special case where you only want to deploy from, say, a folder inside your GitHub repository, you would just enter the path to that folder, and it'll only deploy those files inside of that folder. But since I just want to deploy from root, I'm just going to hit enter. The next step is very important because it asks if our app consists of multiple components. Now, in other words, if I have an app that has a front end that's maybe in React, Angular, or some Node.js framework, but my back end is in another runtime environment, such as Python with Flask, or even an Express backend, these would be considered two separate components because they each have a different package list that needs to be installed separately and different start commands that each need to be run independently for the application as a whole to run. Now, in a lot of cases, most applications only require a single service or a single component, so only one start command is needed and one install command is needed to install all project dependencies. For the project that I'm cloning, it's a Meteor application, so I only have to run one install command and one start command to start the whole application. So I'm going to consider that a single component application and type N for no. However, later in this video, I will be deploying an app that consists of multiple components, and I will walk you through that process because it's a little different. So for right now, I'm just going to hit enter to skip, and the next part is going to ask for application environment variables. Now for me, I don't actually require any environment variables to run my application, but I'm still going to walk you through this step just to show you how it works. So if I hit Y for yes, it's going to ask us for our environment variable key. So they're key value pairs, so you're going to enter the key and then the value associated with that key. So for example, if I have an API key, I might just type in the name of that API key, and then I'm going to enter the value for that API key. So let's say it's 1, 2, 3. If you have another environment variable that you want, you're just going to continue hitting yes or Y for yes, and then you're going to keep entering those key value pairs. So if I have a password, I might enter it here and then whatever that password is. Once you're done entering all your environment variables, you can just hit enter to continue. And these environment variables will be placed in a hidden .env file in your root directory of your project. The next step is going to ask us for a build command. If your application requires you to build your project before starting it, you're just going to enter that build command here. But if not, you can just skip it. The next step is to enter the install command to install all of your project dependencies. Since my application is a Meteor application that runs on Node.js, I'm going to use npm install to install all of my project dependencies. The next step is going to be your start command. For me, it's as simple as npm start, but your command may be a little more involved, especially if you have separate options and separate flags for your start command, such as a host name, a port number, or any other special flags needed to deploy your application. Once you enter that, you can just hit start. And the next step is going to ask you for the underlying runtime environment that for your project. For me, because it's a Meteor application, it runs on Node.js, so I'm just going to type Node.js. The next part is one of the most important parts, especially if it applies to your application. It's going to ask if it requires any special services that need to run on your container. Now, services are different than dependencies or packages that your project requires. So you can't just use a simple npm command or a pip command to install these services. You have to install these services system-wide so that your service manager, such as systemd for different Linux distributions, can start and stop services as needed. So services such as MongoDB, Docker, PostgreSQL, or any other number of services are actually controlled by your system manager or systemd, and it actually starts these daemons or these processes in the background a lot of the times. A lot of these services also require multiple different commands to actually install them, because some of them require special keys that you need to install on your computer in order to install any packages from them, just to make sure that you're installing packages from the correct service or repository. So what we do on our script is, in the background, we actually have a master list of about 15 different services that you can choose from. And anytime you type in a service, it'll copy those commands needed to install that service and run those inside your container. So for my case, I actually do use MongoDB. So since I am using a service, I'm going to type in Y, and then the next step is just going to be to enter the name of that service. So I'm just going to type in MongoDB. And as you can see here, it added MongoDB to our container. Now, your container may require multiple different services, so for however many services you need to install, you can enter them here. However, there may be scenarios where you need a special service that is not actually in our service map. If you want to enter a service like this, you're going to have to enter each installation command one by one. So to do this, you're just going to type in C, and it's going to prompt you for all the commands that you need to install that service on your container. So for this part, I'm actually going to walk you through the process of entering all these commands for a certain service. This service is going to be Nginx, and while it actually is contained in our service map, I'm just going to pretend that it's not and that we have to enter this separately. So I have a list of the install commands right here, and it's actually 4 different commands. The first one's just going to be a sudo apt update y, just to update all of our packages before we install this service. The second command is actually going to be installing Nginx itself. So we're going to use sudo and then apt as our package manager, and then just install Nginx. And then finally, and these are important, we want to enable and we want to start this service with our service manager. So to do this, I'm just going to type in sudo system control and then enable Nginx. And then I'm going to run sudo system control and then start Nginx. And just like this, these are all the commands needed to install and start Nginx on our container. Once you're done, you can just type enter. And if you've entered all of your services and custom commands, if you require any, you can just hit enter for the next step. And the next step is really all automatic because it has all the information it needs now to automatically deploy your container. So right now it's going to begin the cloning process. It's going to use DHCP to automatically allocate an IP address for you. It's going to install all of your dependencies. It's going to start all of your services, install all your packages, everything it needs to do to actually get your container or application up and running. So this is going to take a few minutes, and I'll come back when it's all finished. So the script just finished, and now we have all of the details needed to actually access our container. You notice that there is a note that says additional background scripts are being ran in detached terminal sessions. Now, if you were unlucky enough to have your container have a even container ID, for load balancing on our side, we actually have to migrate that container to another machine. So that can take up to a minute or two. So just wait a minute or two, and then you should be able to access your container normally. So since we're actually deploying our application automatically, all I have to do now is just go to the link that was given to me by the script and then paste that into my web browser like this. And then you can see that my application is already deployed. I didn't have to go in my container. I didn't have to SSH and do everything manually. It did it all for me. And to test that my database is working, I can just create a random account here, and then I can register it. Oh, okay. Apparently I already have that account, so I'll just enter a random email, which doesn't have an account associated with it, and perfect, it created that account. So it seems like everything is working. And if you like the Proxmox Web GUI, you can navigate there, and you should be able to see your container listed here. You'll have 2 tags. One will be your username, and then the other one will be the Linux distribution that your container is running on. Okay, so now we're at the second part of the video where we're going to deploy an application automatically that consists of multiple different components. And to kind of show you what I mean by this is I have an example repository that I created. It's called a polyglot test, poly because multiple components. And you can see I have a backend and a front end folder. My backend is Flask, so it's Python runtime. So it's just my app here. I have one route for an API endpoint. And if I go back to my home directory and then go to my front end, it's actually a node. It's running on Vite or Node.js. So you can see my Vite configuration file. But the whole idea is that my front end and my back end are independent services or independent components that each require their own set of packages to be installed to actually run them. So for situations like these, which are not, in my opinion, like super uncommon, I'm going to show you how to deploy these automatically as well. So we're going to go back to this create container script, and I'm actually going to skip until the deployment steps, just because everything else is sort of redundant. And as before, the first few steps are the same. So it's going to ask me for my project repository link, the branch I want to deploy from, and then the directory inside that branch that I want to deploy from. So I'm just going to enter that information real quick. And here, it's going to ask if my app consists of multiple components. And for this demo, at least, since it does, I'm going to type in Y for yes. And the first step is going to be to enter our environment variables. So my app does not actually require any environment variables, but again, I'm going to just enter dummy ones just to walk you through the process. So I'll type in Y again. And the first thing it's going to prompt me is actually for the path to the component that I want to enter those environment variables in. So the way my repository is set up is I have a folder called frontend for my frontend component, and then another one respectively called backend for my backend component. So within each of those folders, I have different sets of environment variables that are required. So for this, I'm just going to start with my front end, and I'm going to enter the path to my front end from relative to my root directory that I entered a few steps before. So since I entered the root directory for my project to deploy from, I'm just going to enter front end / to the path to my front end. But again, if you entered a different root directory, then you got to be careful with the paths that you enter to make sure that it's not absolute and that it'll actually read from the correct folder. So now, once I've entered my path, now it's going to start asking me for the environment variable key value pairs. So I might, again, have an API key and then enter that value. And then if I have another one, I can continue to enter them for as many as I have. But let's just say that's the only one I need for my front end, right? So I'm just going to hit enter, and you'll see it's going to re-prompt me the same thing it did a few prompts earlier. It's going to prompt me for any other component that I have. Now, I have a backend, and that requires a different set of environment variables. So this time around, I'm going to enter backend / and then the same thing, any environment variables I have for that component. So I might have a password, and then I'm just going to enter that password here. And that's my only environment variable. So I'm going to hit enter to continue. And again, it's going to re-prompt me. It's going to keep re-prompting you until you've entered all of your components, or at least all of the components that require environment variables. And you'll quickly see that this is a common process for doing this with these sort of applications. We have to account for each of the different folders that require different package lists, different installation commands, different start commands, all of that stuff. So the next step is entering any build commands that I have. Now, my application does not require any build commands, and I'm not going to enter any here, but it does require installation commands and start commands, and that process is identical to the build command step. Now I'm going to go ahead and enter my installation commands for each component. So once again, I'll start with my front end. And here, because it's running in a Node.js environment, I'm going to be utilizing npm to install all of my npm packages, and that's just going to be npm install. Now, again, re-prompting me, this time for the backend, and I'm going to enter the command to install all of my Python dependencies using pip. One thing I would recommend for Python is to put all of your requirements in a requirements.txt file, and then use pip install with an R flag, and then the path to your requirements.txt file. Since for some reason I put my requirements.txt file in my root directory, I have to make sure that when I'm entering this command, I go back one directory to where that requirements.txt file is, so it knows where to find that file to install those commands. Without doing this, it's actually going to install from the wrong directory, and I won't even have any of those packages available in my backend. So it probably won't even work, and my application will fail to deploy. This is why it's super important to pay attention to the paths that you're using to enter these different components and these different installation commands in. All right, so I'm done with that, and there's no other components that require installation commands. So I'm just going to hit enter, and now I'm going to do the same exact process, this time with my start commands. So for my front end, that's just npm run dev. And for my backend, I'm just going to set my Flask environment variable here to deployment. and then type in Flask run. And that's my run command for my backend Flask server. Now this step is really important, especially if you're using a service such as Docker. A lot of the times, if you have multiple different components, you still might want to run a command at the root directory of your project. So for example, if you're using Docker with a bunch of different Docker services, you might run docker build to build an image and then docker compose up to actually start all of your services. This is usually ran in the root directory. However, again, you still may have different components that you still need to install packages for. Even if you're not using Docker, but you still need to run some sort of command or commands in the root directory of your project, this is the place to specify those commands. Now, I'm not using Docker in my project, and I don't have any commands that I need to run at the root directory, so I'm just going to hit enter. But again, this is a good place to put them if you do have any. Next is specifying our runtime environments for each of the components. So it's going to actually track all of the different components that you've entered throughout all of these steps and just prompt you for the runtime for each of those. So for my front end, again, I'm using Node.js runtime. So I'm going to hit Node.js. And then for my backend, that's Python. So I'm going to type Python. It's as simple as that. Now the service step is actually the same as in the first part of this video. So if you skipped ahead of this part, I recommend going back and watching my sort of explanation on the services part of it. For this application, I don't require any services, but just to show you it one more time, let's say I do. So I'm going to type Y, and then I'm just going to enter a few random services that I might need, even though I don't need those in my project. Just to show you again how it works, I'm going to enter those here. Now, once I've entered all the different services that I need for my application, I'm good to go. I've entered all the information that the script needs to actually automatically deploy my container. So I can just hit enter, and you can see that it's going to begin the container creation process. So it's going to clone the necessary template and then go through all of those steps again to install the dependencies, to clone the repository, to run the start commands, all of that stuff. So this may take a few minutes, and I will come back when it's all done. So it's been a few minutes and the script has finished. You can see from the output here that we get all of the information about the container, all of our port numbers, which are very important, so make sure to save those. We get our container ID, our internal IP, our domain name importantly, and then the command to SSH into our container. So just always wait about a minute or two after the script finishes, just for all the background scripts to finish, especially if your container has to migrate. But I did wait a minute or two, so let's copy this link, and then I'll open my web browser, and then I'm just going to paste that link in here. And if we did this correctly, it should be automatically deployed. And you can see here that it is. It's a simple web app, so we have the Vite.js front end, and then it's calling the API from the Flask server to get this text on the screen. So just loading it right now, we can see that both of the components are up and running. And then to actually verify this, we can SSH into our container. So I'm just going to copy this command, open a new terminal window here, and then I'm going to SSH to our container. We're going to accept that foreign fingerprint. And if we run SSS and then TCP, UDP, listen, and then the port numbers, and we'll grep for listen, we can see we have those services listening automatically in the background. So we have our Node.js app right here. And then we have our Flask server right here listening on our local host. Looks like everything's working correctly. One last thing I want to show you is that those environment variables that we had in our script earlier should be present on our container. So if we actually cd into our front end directory, for example, if we do an LA, we can see we have the hidden environment variable file. So if we just cat that, we can see we have that environment variable right here that I added in the script. We can do the same thing for the backend, LSLA. We can see we have another environment variable file, and this one should be different, and we can see our password right here. So if you do require environment variables, this is where you'll find them. So that's about all I have for this video. I hope this helped and that I explained it clearly so that you're able to replicate it with your own project and understand the difference between deploying a app with a single component or a single service, and then the differences between that and a app with multiple components or services like we just did with our Flask backend and our Vite.js front end. So I hope that helps. I'm going to be posting another video about doing this in GitHub Actions, so using a CI/CD pipeline to even automate this process further during your development lifecycle. So hope that helps. Check the description for those videos, and thank you. Goodbye.